The familiar route. Tom Clayton had worked for the Postal Service for over 2 decades. As the years passed, the familiar clinking of mailboxes and the echoing creak of porch steps became comforting notes in the symphony of his routine. Maple Avenue, with its familiar streets, neatly trimmed lawns, and residents who had become almost like family, had seen Tom on countless mornings. His schedule was more than precise. It was practically woven into the heartbeat of the neighborhood. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, who always had a small tin of fresh-baked cookies waiting for him every Friday. Mr. Thompson, who had an eccentric passion for garden gnomes, which multiplied each spring across his flower beds. And, of course, Eleanor Jenkins, a vibrant widow in her 70s. She had a laugh as warm as her golden retriever, Max, whose daily welcome was as predictable as the sunrise. Tom was used to Max's enthusiastic bark, a constant in his day. But that morning, when he reached the Jenkins house, there was an unsettling silence. The curtains were drawn tightly against the morning light, and the once cheerful, bustling front garden seemed unusually still. Tom felt a ripple of discomfort, though he tried to shake it off, telling himself he was being foolish. For the first time, Tom felt like an outsider as he stood there with Mrs. Jenkins' mail in his hands. The porch was empty of her usual potted plants, and the sense of life that typically radiated from a house felt muted, almost eerie. Max's absence was a glaring gap in his morning, like a missing verse in a familiar song. As he stood there, the routine had changed, his morning disrupted by an intangible sense of urgency. Tom wasn't someone to jump to conclusions, but that day, his instinct to move felt unshakable, as if every fiber of his being were urging him forward. He tried to peer through the windows, looking for any sign of movement. In the stillness, he approached the door and was about to leave the mail when he heard something. A faint, barely discernible sound, a low whimper that made his skin prickle. Tom leaned closer, straining to hear. The door was locked, a barrier between him and the unknown situation that felt heavier than the mailbag slung over his shoulder. He couldn't ignore it. He reached out and knocked, the sound of his fist against the door echoing with a surprising force. "Mrs. Jenkins?" he called, his voice carrying a hint of hope that she'd respond with a reassuring chuckle, her face appearing in the window with a wave. But only silence answered. Anxiety gnawed at him. Should he move on? What if his instinct was wrong? He imagined Max's usual bark breaking the silence, but all he heard was the low, rhythmic creak of an old porch swing as it swayed in the breeze. And then he heard it again, a faint scratching, desperate and panicked, coming from the base of the door. It was Max, his normally cheerful retriever friend, now a shadow of distress. The scratching intensified, each clawing sound a plea, pulling Tom back to the door. His heart beat faster as he called out again, louder this time. "Mrs. Jenkins, Eleanor, are you all right in there?" He felt the weight of the words, their resonance not just filling the air, but the silence of the morning. The possibility that something was wrong echoed back, louder than he expected, and a slow, cold wave of realization swept over him. Max's frantic scratching and whimpering continued, piercing the calm of Maple Avenue. There was no doubt about it now. Something was indeed wrong. Tom could feel it as surely as he felt his pulse quickening. It was an unspoken call for help, a need that defied his rational mind, and touched his heart deeply. Tom tried the door, but it held firm, locked against his attempts to enter. He glanced around, wondering if he should fetch help from a neighbor or continue waiting. But he knew there was no time to lose. With one last look at Max, whose pleading eyes met his with an urgency that left no room for doubt, he reached for his phone, fingers trembling slightly as he dialed 911. 911. "What's your emergency?" The calm, steady voice on the other end grounded him for a moment. "Yes, my name's Tom. I'm the mailman on Maple Avenue," he began, feeling the weight of each word. He explained the odd silence, the empty porch, Max's distress, and the faint sounds he thought he'd heard. The operator asked him a series of questions, her voice calm and probing, each one feeling more crucial than the last. Tom's responses were almost automatic, but every word added gravity to the situation. His thoughts kept flashing to Eleanor, her kind eyes, her laughter, the effortless way she had brightened his mornings. What if she was in danger, just beyond that locked door? Within minutes, he could hear the distant wail of an ambulance approaching, and a relief mingled with dread as he stood with Max, who had finally stopped scratching. Tom gave Max a gentle pat on the head, his heart pounding as he mentally prepared for whatever awaited them. In that moment, he realized the depth of his attachment to these people, his neighbors, and the truth of the matter. He was far more than just a mailman. He was part of their lives in ways he hadn't fully understood until now, a silent witness to the joys and struggles they experienced behind closed doors. As the ambulance rounded the corner, the weight of responsibility and connection settled on him. He would stay there, with Max by his side, until he knew Eleanor Jenkins was safe. The doors of decision. The ambulance arrived with a flash of lights and a blast of sirens, shattering the quiet morning of Maple Avenue. Tom watched as the paramedics hopped out and moved with the kind of efficiency only years of training could produce. Despite the controlled chaos, Tom felt as if he were moving in slow motion. Every detail was etched in his mind. The deep lines of worry on his face reflected back in the glistening windows of the ambulance, Max's tense posture as he watched strangers approach his home, and the quiet ripple of neighbors gathering at their doorsteps, drawn by the unfamiliar urgency. One of the paramedics approached Tom, his voice calm but eyes sharp as he asked for any information Tom might have. Tom swallowed, his voice almost failing him as he spoke. "It's Mrs. Jenkins," he managed, his voice low and thick with concern. "I deliver here every day. And cheese, well, she's usually outside around this time. Today, though, nothing. And Max here." He gestured toward the dog. "He's been scratching at the door, whining. I thought I heard something inside, but I can't be sure." The paramedic nodded, giving Tom a reassuring smile as he relayed the information to his partner. They moved with swift precision, one pulling out a small toolkit from the ambulance, while the other knelt by the door, examining it closely. Tom's heart thudded in his chest, his breath catching as he watched them work. Max let out a low whine, his eyes never leaving the door. It was as if he sensed something was wrong beyond the human ability to detect. Tom gave the dog a gentle scratch behind the ears, feeling a lump rise in his throat. This was more than just the ordinary concern of a mailman for one of his regulars. It was something deep and instinctive. He felt responsible, bound to Mrs. Jenkins by an unseen thread. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the paramedics managed to get the door open. As it swung inward, a blast of stale air rushed out, carrying with it a heavy silence that seemed to amplify the urgency of the situation. Tom hesitated, suddenly unsure if he should follow them inside. But Max, seemingly beyond hesitation, darted forward, his nails clicking urgently on the hardwood floor. The paramedics exchanged a quick glance, one nodding as if granting permission. Tom followed, crossing the threshold into Mrs. Jenkins' world, a world that had previously existed in his mind as a warm, comforting place filled with the scent of blooming flowers and fresh coffee. Now, though, it felt cold, shadowed, as if something had stolen the very soul from the house. The hallway stretched ahead of him, its soft carpet muffling his footsteps. He trailed behind the paramedics, keeping a respectful distance as they called out, "Mrs. Jenkins, Eleanor, can you hear us?" Max darted toward a room at the end of the hall, barking and scratching at the door. Tom's stomach twisted as he watched the paramedics move quickly, stepping around Max and opening the door with careful urgency. Inside was Mrs. Jenkins, sprawled on the floor beside her bed, her face pale and still. She seemed so small, so fragile, a stark contrast to the lively woman he'd seen gardening just days ago. One of the paramedics dropped to his knees beside her, his fingers pressing gently against her neck as he checked for a pulse. "She's breathing," he said, his voice a low murmur, but his tone held a tension that made Tom's heart hammer. Tom's gaze shifted from the paramedics to Mrs. Jenkins, and for a moment, all he could see was the vibrant woman she used to be, the one who'd offered him lemonade on hot days, who always had a kind word and a bright smile. The image clashed harshly with the reality in front of him, and he felt an ache settle deep within his chest. This woman, his friend, lay vulnerable and weak, and all he could do was watch as strangers worked to save her. The second paramedic spoke into his radio, his voice calm but firm. Possible stroke. Mid-70s female, stable but non-responsive. Initiate IV line and prepare for transport. His words, clinical and detached, grounded Tom in the stark reality of the situation. The next few minutes were a blur of activity. The paramedics attached various monitors to Mrs. Jenkins, the steady beeping of machines filling the room as they worked. They moved with such practiced grace, their hands steady and sure as they lifted her onto a stretcher and adjusted the straps, ensuring she was secure for the journey to the hospital. Tom barely noticed as the paramedics rolled Mrs. Jenkins down the hall and out of the house. He followed in a daze, his eyes locked onto her pale face, willing her to open her eyes, to say something, anything, to reassure him that she was still there, still fighting. But she remained silent, her face as still and pale as a winter morning. Outside, the neighbors had gathered in small clusters, their faces etched with worry and curiosity. Tom caught snippets of whispered conversations, words like stroke and hospital floating through the air like fallen leaves caught in a breeze. "Tom," a voice called out, breaking through his thoughts. He turned to see Mrs. Rodriguez approaching, her brow furrowed with concern. Will she be okay? Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would shatter whatever fragile hope they clung to. "I don't know," Tom replied, his voice rough. "They're taking her to the hospital now. I hope she'll be all right." His words felt inadequate, a poor attempt to express the heavy weight of worry that settled in his chest like a stone. As the ambulance pulled away, its siren slicing through the morning air, Tom watched until it disappeared around the corner, leaving behind an unsettling silence that settled over the neighborhood like a blanket of fog. The reality of what had just happened hit him all at once, a wave of fear and helplessness crashing over him. He stood there for a moment, rooted to the spot, his mind racing with questions. Had he acted quickly enough? Should he have called for help sooner? The thought of what might have happened if he hadn't trusted his instincts gnawed at him, leaving him with a hollow ache that he couldn't shake. The crowd began to disperse, neighbors returning to their routines with solemn expressions and quiet murmurs. But Tom remained, standing on Mrs. Jenkins' porch, his hand resting on the doorframe as he tried to process the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. Max sat by his side, his head tilted up at Tom, eyes filled with a loyalty that offered a small measure of comfort. He glanced down at the dog, giving him a gentle pat. "Good boy, Max," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You did a good job. She'd be proud of you." Max let out a soft whine, as if he understood, and nudged his nose against Tom's hand. For a brief moment, Tom felt a connection, a sense of purpose and shared responsibility, that soothed his frayed nerves. With a sigh, he took one last look at Mrs. Jenkins' house before heading back to his mail truck. His mind was heavy with thoughts of her, with memories of the little moments they'd shared, the way she'd brighten his day with her warm smile and gentle words. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that his role as a mailman had somehow expanded beyond the simple act of delivering letters and packages. He was now a witness, a silent guardian of the lives and stories behind every door on his route. As he climbed into his truck and continued his route, he found himself glancing at each house with a new awareness, his gaze lingering a bit longer than usual. Every door he passed felt like a gateway to a world he didn't fully know but was now bound to, a responsibility he hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. The rest of his deliveries blurred together, each stop tinged with a lingering sense of dread. He couldn't help but wonder what other stories lay hidden behind the doors he passed every day. Will he be there in time if someone else needed help? The weight of that question pressed down on him, a heavy reminder of the silent duty he'd unwittingly accepted. When he finally returned to the post office that afternoon, his supervisor, Jerry, greeted him with a concerned look. "You all right, Tom? You look a little off." Tom forced a smile, nodding as he handed over his clipboard. "Just a rough day, I guess." Jerry gave him a sympathetic nod, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Take care of yourself, Tom. You do a lot for the people on your route, more than you probably realize." As he drove home, Jerry's words echoed in his mind, stirring a new resolve within him. He'd always thought of himself as just a mailman, someone who delivered letters and packages, a small part of the daily routines of the people he served. But today had shown him that he was more than that. He was a part of their lives, a thread woven into the fabric of their stories, their joys, and their struggles. That night, as he lay in bed, Tom couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Jenkins. He replayed the day's events in his mind, analyzing every decision, every moment of hesitation. The weight of responsibility settled over him like a blanket, warm and suffocating, a reminder of the quiet power he held in his hands each day. And as he drifted off to sleep, he resolved that he would do everything in his power to honor that responsibility, to be there for the people on his route, to watch over them in ways they might never know or expect. Because, he realized, he was more than just their mailman. He was a part of their lives, a silent witness to their stories, a quiet guardian in the shadows. And he would carry that role with pride, knowing that, in his own way, he was making a difference. The quiet vigil. The next morning, Tom woke up earlier than usual. Sleep had been elusive, his mind filled with thoughts of Mrs. Jenkins, still lying in a hospital bed somewhere, fighting to recover from the stroke that had transformed her life in an instant. He couldn't shake the hollow ache that settled in his chest every time he thought of her, of the lively woman who had always been a bright spot on his route, now rendered silent and vulnerable. As he prepared for the day, a resolve built within him, settling into his bones like a newfound purpose. Today, he would go beyond simply delivering the mail. He would make it a priority to keep an eye on the elderly residents along his route, to check in on them however he could. Yesterday had shown him just how close to disaster any of them could be, how life could shift from ordinary to tragic in the blink of an eye. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon as Tom loaded his truck, the sky painted with soft hues of pink and orange. He'd always appreciated the quiet mornings, the streets still hushed and calm, with only the occasional dog walker or early riser sharing the start of the day with him. But today, the quiet felt heavy, weighted with the knowledge that one of his own was missing from the rhythm of the neighborhood. As he drove down Maple Avenue, the familiar landmarks passed by, the tall oak trees casting long shadows across the pavement, the neat rows of houses, each with its own unique charm. And yet, everything felt different. He noticed things he'd never paid attention to before, the subtle signs of age on the houses, the worn edges of doors and fences, the occasional broken window shutter. All of these small details now seemed like clues, hints of lives lived and challenges faced behind closed doors. His first stop was Mrs. Rodriguez's house. She was one of his regulars, a sweet elderly woman with a fondness for cats and a penchant for baking. Today, as he placed her letters in the mailbox, he found himself lingering, listening for any sounds from within. Just as he was about to leave, her door creaked open, and there she was, smiling up at him with a tin of freshly baked cookies in her hands. "Good morning, Tom," she greeted, her voice warm as she held out the tin. "Thought you could use a little treat." Tom smiled, accepting the tin gratefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Rodriguez. You always spoil me." As they exchanged small talk, he found himself asking, "Have you been feeling all right lately? Anything you need help with?" She gave him a surprised look, her smile faltering slightly before she nodded. "Oh, I'm just fine, dear. Why do you ask?" Tom hesitated, not wanting to alarm her, but he couldn't hold back. "It's just, well, You heard about Mrs. Jenkins, right? She had a stroke yesterday. I'm just making sure everyone's doing okay." Her face softened, and she reached out to pat his arm. "You're a good man, Tom. Don't you worry about me. I've got my children calling every other day to check in, and my neighbor's boy helps me with the groceries. But thank you, truly. It's kind of you to care." He nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. But as he turned to leave, he glanced back, his gaze lingering a moment longer. For the first time, he saw her as more than just Mrs. Rodriguez, the sweet lady with the cats. She was a person with a life full of challenges and victories, a story written in the wrinkles and lines of her face. And that story could change at any moment, just as it had for Mrs. Jenkins. At his next stop, Mr. Thompson's house, Tom hesitated before knocking on the door. He knew Mr. Thompson was a proud man, fiercely independent, but he couldn't ignore the worry gnawing at him. When Mr. Thompson answered the door, his face lit up with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "Well, this is unusual," he said, crossing his arms over his chest. "Mailman coming to the door instead of just dropping the mail in the box." Tom chuckled, shifting awkwardly on his feet. "Thought I'd just say hello, see how you were doing. Been a bit of a rough week, you know." Mr. Thompson's face softened slightly, and he leaned against the doorframe. "You're talking about Eleanor, aren't you?" Tom nodded, the weight of yesterday's events settling heavily on his shoulders. "Yeah, I don't know. I wanted to make sure everyone's all right." Mr. Thompson gave him a long, thoughtful look, then nodded slowly. "It's good of you to care, Tom. But don't go carrying the world's problems on your shoulders. People like Eleanor and me, we've been around a while. We know how to look after ourselves." Tom nodded, but as he left, he couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Thompson's words held a deeper truth. These people had lived full lives, overcome countless challenges, and survived in ways he couldn't even imagine. But that didn't make them invincible. One slip, one moment of vulnerability, and they could be gone. And Tom wasn't ready to lose any more of them. As he continued his route, he began to notice small changes in the way he interacted with the residents. He lingered a bit longer at each stop, asking after their health, offering small favors. His reputation as just the mailman began to shift subtly, and he found himself becoming more of a confident, a quiet presence who listened and cared. When he reached the end of Maple Avenue, he paused, glancing back down the street. A thought struck him, a bold, maybe slightly reckless idea, but one that he couldn't shake. What if he could do more? What if he could create a system, a way to check in on the elderly residents, even if just in small ways? He thought of Mrs. Jenkins lying in the hospital, her life forever changed by a single stroke, and knew he couldn't just sit back and do nothing. That evening, he made a list, jotting down the names of every elderly resident on his route. He noted their addresses, any small details he remembered about their daily routines, the times they usually picked up their mail, or when he'd seen them outside gardening or talking with neighbors. He went over it again and again, making sure he'd remembered everyone, a quiet resolve settling within him. The following morning, he stopped by the local community center, where he met Sarah Chen, a young, energetic organizer with a passion for helping the elderly. She listened intently as he explained his idea, her eyes lighting up with excitement as he laid out his plans. "So, you're thinking of a kind of wellness check-in program," she said, her voice filled with enthusiasm. "Something where people like you, who interact with the community regularly, could check in on elderly residents. I love it." Tom felt a rush of relief and gratitude as he realized she understood exactly what he was aiming for. They spent hours discussing the details, planning how they could recruit other mail carriers, delivery drivers, even local volunteers, to join the program. They could create a network, a web of connections that would ensure no one was ever truly alone. As the days passed, word of the program spread through the community, neighbors volunteering to be part of it, offering to check in on each other, to share their contact information, to build a safety net that stretched beyond Tom's simple idea. The sense of camaraderie and purpose grew, a powerful reminder of the strength in unity, in people coming together to support one another. Tom's role in the community took on new meaning. No longer was he just a mailman. He was a vital part of a network that kept the elderly residents safe, that ensured they were seen, valued, and cared for. And in those quiet moments, as he made his rounds and spoke with the people he'd come to know as more than just names on envelopes, he felt a sense of fulfillment he'd never known before. One afternoon, as he was finishing up his route, his phone buzzed with a call from the hospital. It was Dr. Patel, the doctor who had treated Mrs. Jenkins. Her voice was calm and reassuring as she told him the news he'd been waiting for. Mrs. Jenkins was stable and recovering, though it would be a long road to regain her strength. The relief that washed over Tom was almost overwhelming. He thanked Dr. Patel, his voice choked with emotion, as he promised to visit Mrs. Jenkins as soon as she was ready for visitors. He had a sense that this journey was just beginning, that there was still so much more he could do, not just for her, but for everyone on his route. The next morning, he arrived at the hospital with a small bouquet of flowers and a bright yellow potted plant he knew would make her smile. As he walked through the sterile hallways, the weight of the past few days settled over him, a quiet reminder of the impact he'd made, of the lives he'd touched in ways he'd never anticipated. When he entered her room, Mrs. Jenkins looked up, a faint smile on her face as she saw him. She was still weak, her movements slow and careful, but her eyes sparkled with the same warmth and kindness he remembered. He placed the flowers on her bedside table, his heart full as he watched her gaze at them, her fingers brushing gently over the petals. "Tom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." He reached out, gently squeezing her hand as he smiled. "It's good to see you, Eleanor. I've missed you." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of words unnecessary, their connection stronger than ever. Tom felt a deep gratitude, a sense of purpose that filled him with a quiet joy. In that moment, he knew that this was only the beginning of a new journey, one that would transform not just his role as a mailman, but his life. Because he was more than just their mailman now. He was a part of their lives, a quiet guardian, a beacon of compassion in a world that often forgot its elderly and vulnerable. And as he left the hospital that day, he walked with a new confidence, knowing that he would continue to be there for them, for his neighbors, his friends, his community. Ripples through the neighborhood. After his visit with Mrs. Jenkins, Tom's dedication to his community seemed to deepen. His simple act of reaching out to an elderly woman in need had stirred something within him. And it wasn't only his life that had shifted. Word spread about the mailman hero, as people began calling him, and the neighborhood slowly became charged with a renewed sense of unity. It started subtly. Neighbors who usually exchanged little more than nods began greeting one another with warm smiles. People checked in on elderly residents more frequently, stopping by with groceries, offering to mow lawns, or simply spending time chatting on front porches. It was as if a quiet energy pulsed through the streets, binding the community in a way that had long been forgotten. One morning, as Tom was loading his truck for his route, Jerry, his supervisor, approached him, holding a worn, folded newspaper. "Look at this, Tom," Jerry said, his tone a mix of pride and disbelief. He unfolded the paper, revealing an article with the headline, "Mailman's Heroic Act Sparks Community Change." Beneath the title was a picture of Tom, leaning against his mail truck, a determined look on his face as he recounted the events of that day to the journalist. The article recounted the details of how he had saved Mrs. Jenkins, sparking a movement that led to the development of the wellness check program he had initiated with Sarah Chen. Tom scanned the words, feeling a mix of pride and embarrassment. He had never sought the limelight, and the idea of his face in the newspaper felt foreign and uncomfortable. But as he read further, a sense of quiet satisfaction crept in. His actions had made a difference, not just for Mrs. Jenkins, but for everyone in the neighborhood. "That's some story, Tom," Jerry said, clapping him on the back. You're doing more than just delivering mail now. You're part of these people's lives in a way most of us can't even imagine." Tom shrugged, his cheeks tinged pink. "I just did what anyone would do, Jerry. It didn't feel like anything special at the time." But Jerry shook his head. "Most people wouldn't have noticed, let alone acted on it. That's what makes you different, Tom. And look at the difference it's made." The words stayed with Tom as he started his route that day, carrying his usual load of letters and packages, but feeling the weight of a newfound purpose settle on his shoulders. He stopped by Mrs. Rodriguez's home, handing her a few letters along with a friendly smile, noticing the gentle gratitude in her eyes as she held his hand a moment longer than usual. "Tom, I can't thank you enough for what you did for Eleanor," she said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "It's because of you that we all feel a little safer now." As he made his way through the neighborhood, each stop became a moment of connection. He found himself lingering a little longer, sharing conversations that went beyond small talk. At each home, he heard stories of lives that he hadn't known before, fragments of joys and sorrows, struggles and triumphs. Every person had their own unique journey, their own worries and triumphs. And though they had lived side by side for years, it was only now that these connections were truly coming alive. On Maple Avenue, he stopped at Mr. Thompson's house. Mr. Thompson, who usually kept to himself, met him at the door, leaning heavily on his cane. "Tom," he began, his voice gruff but sincere, "I owe you an apology." Tom's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Apology? For what?" "For not seeing it sooner," Mr. Thompson admitted, his gaze dropping. "All these years, we've been living next to each other, but I didn't really know any of you. What you did for Eleanor made me realize I've been cooped up in my own world, not paying attention to the people around me." Tom felt a warmth spread through him as he placed a reassuring hand on Mr. Thompson's shoulder. "None of us realized it, Mr. Thompson. But we're all learning now. That's what matters." The days continued to pass, each one infused with a sense of purpose that had become a part of Tom's routine. He watched as Maple Avenue transformed, as neighbors once strangers became friends, united in a shared mission to support one another. The Wellness Check program blossomed, with volunteers from every corner of the community stepping up to participate. Tom's simple list of names and addresses had grown into a network, a web of connections that stretched beyond his own route and into every street and home in the neighborhood. One Saturday, as he made his usual rounds, he noticed a gathering at the community center. Curious, he parked his truck and wandered over to see what was happening. Inside, he found a room filled with familiar faces, neighbors, volunteers, local officials, even a few journalists who had caught wind of the story. Sarah Chen stood at the front of the room, her face lit with excitement as she explained the next steps for the wellness program. "Thanks to Tom," she said, gesturing to him with a smile. "We've seen just how much of a difference one person can make. But it's going to take all of us to keep this going." Tom felt a surge of pride as the room broke into applause, the warmth of the crowd's appreciation settling over him like a comforting embrace. He hadn't expected this, hadn't wanted the attention, but seeing the faces of his neighbors, knowing he had played a part in bringing them together, filled him with a sense of fulfillment he'd never known. As the applause died down, Sarah continued, detailing the ways they could expand the program, how they could reach even more people in the community. She talked about partnerships with local organizations, training sessions for volunteers, and even plans to extend the program to neighboring towns. The meeting ended with a call for volunteers to join a new committee that would oversee the wellness program, and Tom found himself stepping forward without hesitation. He was no longer just a mailman. He was a part of something bigger, a movement that was changing lives, and he wanted to be a part of it every step of the way. After the meeting, Sarah approached him, her face filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Tom," she said, her voice soft but filled with sincerity. "You've done so much for us, for everyone here." Tom shrugged, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It's not just me. It's everyone. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." She shook her head, her gaze steady and unwavering. "No, Tom, you were more than that. You were the spark that lit this fire." Over the next few months, the wellness program became a fixture in the community, a part of the daily fabric of Maple Avenue. The town held workshops on health and safety for the elderly, organized volunteer rotations for those who needed help with groceries or housework, and even created a phone tree where neighbors could check in on each other regularly. Tom's once quiet route now buzzed with energy and connection, each home a reminder of the lives he was helping to protect. One day, as he delivered mail to the Hendersons, he was greeted by young Emma Henderson, her eyes bright with excitement. She held up a crayon drawing, a picture of Tom standing next to his mail truck, with a big smile on his face. "This is you, Mr. Tom," she announced proudly. "You're the hero of Maple Avenue." Tom chuckled, touched by the simplicity of her words. He had never considered himself a hero. He was just a man doing his job, trying to do what felt right. But as he looked at the drawing, at the simple, joyful lines of a child's view of the world, he felt a swell of pride. Emma's mother appeared at the door, a grateful smile on her face. "Thank you, Tom," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "You've done so much for this community, more than you know." Tom accepted the drawing, his heart full as he tucked it carefully into his mail bag. It was a small gesture, but it meant more to him than any award or recognition. It was a reminder that the work he was doing was real, that he was making a difference, not just in the lives of the elderly residents, but in the lives of everyone on Maple Avenue. That night, as he sat on his porch, he watched the sun dip below the horizon, the sky painted with hues of gold and pink. He thought of Mrs. Jenkins, still recovering but growing stronger every day, and of all the people he had come to know through this journey. He thought of the lives he was now a part of, the connections he had forged, and the sense of purpose that had blossomed within him. He wasn't just their mailman. He was a guardian, a friend, a quiet hero in the background of their lives. And as he sat there, watching the stars blink into the night sky, he knew that this was only the beginning. Because true change, he realized, wasn't something that happened in a single moment. It was a ripple, a series of small acts that grew and spread, connecting people, bringing them together in ways they never expected. And he would be there, every step of the way, delivering more than just mail. He would deliver hope, connection, and a quiet reminder that, in a world that often felt too big and too busy, there was always room for kindness. A growing legacy. Months passed, and Maple Avenue became a model of community connection and care. The wellness program that had started as a small idea between Tom and Sarah Chen had grown into something far greater than either of them had imagined. Local newspapers continued to feature stories on the neighborhood's transformation, and other towns began to take notice, curious about how this ordinary street had become a hub of unity, compassion, and vigilance. Tom had grown accustomed to his new role. Though he still drove the same route each day, delivering letters and packages, he now carried more than just mail. His conversations with residents had deepened, as they'd come to rely on him not only for news of neighbors, but also for a steady presence in a world that sometimes felt unpredictable. He became a source of comfort for many, a quiet strength they knew they could depend on. One sunny afternoon, as he walked down his route, he noticed Mr. Thompson sitting on his front porch, waving Tom over with an enthusiastic motion that was unusual for the man's typically reserved demeanor. As Tom approached, Mr. Thompson gave him a nod of gratitude. "Tom, I'm glad you stopped by," Mr. Thompson said, his voice tinged with a rare softness. "I wanted to show you something." He held out a framed picture, a photograph of the neighborhood volunteers standing in front of the community center, including Tom, Sarah Chen, and several other neighbors who had stepped up to help. "We're going to hang this in the community center. Thought you might like to see it before we put it up." Tom held the frame, a swell of pride building in his chest. The picture captured more than just people standing together. It represented everything they had built, the lives they had touched, and the future they were shaping. "It's a good-looking bunch," Tom said with a soft chuckle, handing the picture back. "Hard to believe we were all strangers not that long ago." Mr. Thompson nodded, his eyes crinkling with warmth. "You know, Tom, it's not just what you did for Eleanor. You gave the rest of us something to believe in. Reminded us of what it means to be neighbors. I just wanted you to know. I'm proud of you." The words settled over Tom like a warm blanket, filling a part of him he hadn't realized had been so empty. Pride wasn't something he often felt, not like this, but Mr. Thompson's words struck a chord, validating everything he'd done. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It means a lot coming from you." As he continued his route that day, he carried the image of that photo in his mind, thinking of each face, each person who had stepped up to make the wellness program a reality. But his thoughts kept drifting to Mrs. Jenkins, whose life had changed so dramatically that day, and who had quietly become a driving force in his life. That evening, after finishing his deliveries, Tom headed to the hospital where Mrs. Jenkins was undergoing therapy. Though her stroke had been severe, she had made steady progress, her strength returning slowly but surely. She had regained some of her speech, and though the words came slower, each one held a significance, a weight that reminded Tom of her resilience. When he entered her room, he found her in a chair by the window, gazing out at the setting sun. She turned, a soft smile lighting her face as she recognized him. "Tom," she greeted, her voice still slow but strong, her gaze filled with warmth. "Eleanor," he replied, pulling up a chair beside her. "You're looking better every day." She laughed, the sound gentle but filled with determination. "I feel better," she replied, her words careful and deliberate. "Thanks to you. And everyone else. It's amazing what you've done." Tom looked down, feeling a familiar wave of humility. "It's not just me, Eleanor. It's the whole neighborhood. They've all stepped up. But you're the reason, Tom," she insisted, her voice firm despite its softness. "You were the one who saw beyond your job, who noticed that I needed help, and who took action. You can't deny the impact you've had." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sky as it shifted from warm orange to deep purple, the stars beginning to blink into view. Tom felt the weight of her words, knowing there was truth in them. But he also knew that the changes went beyond him. The neighborhood's transformation had been a collective effort, a testament to the power of connection and compassion. After a few minutes, Mrs. Jenkins spoke again, her gaze distant as she chose her words carefully. "Tom, I've been doing a lot of thinking. I want to do something more." Tom looked at her with curiosity, leaning forward. "What do you mean?" "I want to start a foundation," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "A foundation to support programs like ours, to help other neighborhoods build the same kind of community. I've seen what can happen when people come together, when they look out for each other, and I want to make sure that happens in more places." Tom felt a surge of admiration as he listened. Here was a woman who had been through so much, who had nearly lost everything. And yet she was looking outward, finding ways to help others. "Eleanor," he began, his voice thick with emotion. That's an incredible idea. I think you could make a real difference." They talked late into the evening, discussing the details, the logistics, the ways they could fund the foundation and bring in volunteers from other neighborhoods. Mrs. Jenkins had already spoken with Sarah Chen, who had agreed to help get the foundation off the ground. They decided to name it the Maple Avenue Foundation, a tribute to the street that had brought them together and inspired a movement. Over the next few weeks, the foundation became a reality. Mrs. Jenkins, though still frail, attended every planning meeting, her presence a source of inspiration for everyone involved. They set up workshops, invited community leaders from neighboring towns, and trained volunteers on how to implement wellness programs in their own neighborhoods. One day, as they held an inaugural meeting for the foundation, Tom found himself standing in front of a group of local officials, volunteers, and community members. Sarah introduced him as the catalyst of Maple Avenue, and he felt a surge of both pride and discomfort as he stepped forward to speak. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before addressing the crowd. "I'm not much of a public speaker," he began with a chuckle, earning a few smiles from the audience. "But I just want to say, I never expected any of this. I was just a mailman doing his job, delivering letters, making my rounds. But I realized that being a part of this community meant more than just dropping off packages. It meant caring about the people behind the doors. It meant listening, paying attention, and being willing to act when something didn't feel right." He paused, his gaze drifting over the crowd. The Maple Avenue Foundation isn't just about our neighborhood. It's about creating communities where people look out for each other, where everyone feels seen and valued. And if we can make that happen here, I believe we can make it happen anywhere. The applause was thunderous, a wave of gratitude and admiration that settled over him like a warm embrace. He saw faces filled with hope, with pride, with the belief that they were part of something bigger than themselves. In that moment, Tom realized that his life had changed in ways he could never have predicted. He was no longer just a mailman. He was a symbol of compassion, a reminder that even the smallest actions could create ripples that reached far beyond what he could see. As the foundation grew, Tom's role expanded. He continued his mail route, but he also became a spokesperson for the foundation, speaking at events, sharing his story, and encouraging others to take an active role in their communities. Each time he spoke, he saw the same reaction, a spark of recognition, a sense of connection, and a renewed commitment to making a difference. Mrs. Jenkins, though still frail, was a constant presence at the foundation's events, her strength and resilience an inspiration to everyone who met her. She and Tom became a team, their friendship deepening as they worked together to build something that would outlast them both. One evening, as they sat together at the community center after a long day of meetings, Mrs. Jenkins turned to him, her gaze soft but filled with determination. "Tom," she said, her voice steady despite her fatigue, "I want you to promise me something." He looked at her, his heart pounding with an unspoken understanding. "Anything, Eleanor." "When I'm gone," she began, her voice faltering slightly, "I want you to keep this going. I want you to make sure that the foundation keeps growing, that the work we started continues." Tom felt a lump form in his throat as he nodded, his voice choked with emotion. "I promise, Eleanor. I'll make sure of it." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of her words settling over him like a gentle rain. He knew that this was more than just a promise. It was a commitment, a responsibility that he would carry for the rest of his life. He had found his purpose, his place in the world, and he was determined to honor it. As the years passed, the Maple Avenue Foundation grew, expanding to towns and cities far beyond their small neighborhood. It became a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of community, and a reminder that one person's actions could change the world. Tom continued his mail route, delivering letters and packages, but his life was richer, his heart fuller. He was no longer just a mailman. He was a guardian, a friend, a leader, and a quiet hero whose legacy would live on long after he was gone. And though Mrs. Jenkins eventually passed away, her spirit remained, a guiding light for everyone who had been touched by her kindness, her resilience, and her unwavering belief in the power of connection. Tom kept his promise, nurturing the foundation, sharing their story, and inspiring others to follow in their footsteps. In the quiet of his later years, as he walked the familiar streets of Maple Avenue, he looked back on his life with a deep sense of gratitude. He had been given the chance to make a difference, to change lives, and to leave a legacy that would outlast him. And as he passed the houses of the people he had come to know and love, he smiled, knowing that he had found his purpose, his place, and his true calling. Because in the end, he wasn't just a mailman. He was a beacon of hope, a reminder that in a world that often felt too big and too busy, there was always room for kindness. The legacy of Maple Avenue. Years had slipped by like pages turning in a well-loved book, each one adding layers of growth, resilience, and connection to Maple Avenue. The neighborhood, once an ordinary cluster of houses, had become a beacon of unity, known across the state and beyond. The Maple Avenue Foundation, spearheaded by Tom and Mrs. Jenkins, had grown into a powerful symbol of what communities could achieve when they looked out for one another. What had once been a simple route through a quiet neighborhood was now a tapestry of relationships, stories, and a living testament to the power of compassion. For Tom, his role in the community had become something akin to a calling. Though the familiar mail truck still crept through Maple Avenue each day, his responsibilities now stretched far beyond sorting and delivering envelopes. His uniform, once a symbol of routine, had transformed into a badge of trust, symbolizing his dedication to the people whose lives he had come to know and love. But as the years continued to pass, a quiet change began to settle over Maple Avenue. New families moved in, the sound of children's laughter filling the streets once again. Old friends passed on, their places taken by younger residents who brought fresh energy, but also unfamiliar faces. Tom watched as the neighborhood evolved, feeling both pride and a twinge of nostalgia. He was now one of the oldest residents on Maple Avenue, a living piece of its history. One evening, after finishing his route, he made his way to the community center for a meeting of the Maple Avenue Foundation. The center's meeting room was filled with familiar faces, some who had been there from the beginning, like Sarah Chen, and others who were newer to the community but equally passionate about the foundation's mission. They greeted him with smiles and nods, the warmth of their regard a constant comfort. As he took his seat, Sarah stood up to address the group, her face filled with a mixture of pride and excitement. "Tonight," she began, "we have a very special announcement. Thanks to the tireless work of all of you, and the inspiration of our founding members, Tom and Mrs. Jenkins, the Maple Avenue Foundation has just secured funding to expand our wellness program across 3 neighboring counties." A wave of applause filled the room, and Tom felt a swell of pride as he looked around at the people he had come to consider family. The foundation, which had started as a small local effort, was now reaching people he would never meet, helping communities he would never see. It was a humbling realization, a reminder of the impact that small acts of kindness could have when nurtured and shared. Sarah continued, her eyes shining as she addressed Tom directly. "And to honor the legacy of our founding members, we've decided to name the new program the Tom Harrison Initiative. This initiative will train volunteers to perform wellness checks, offer companionship, and provide practical support for elderly residents in rural and urban communities alike." Tom felt his face flush as the room erupted in applause, friends and neighbors turning to him with smiles of admiration. He tried to wave off the attention, but Sarah raised a hand, silencing the room with a smile. "Tom, none of us would be here without you. You showed us what it means to care, to pay attention, to be more than just neighbors. Your legacy will live on, helping people long after we're all gone." He stood, clearing his throat as he looked around the room. The words didn't come easily. He was never one for speeches, but he felt the weight of the moment, the responsibility to acknowledge what they had all built together. "Thank you," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I never expected any of this. I was just doing my job, delivering mail, getting to know the people on my route. But you all took that small idea and turned it into something bigger than any of us. The Tom Harrison Initiative isn't just about me. It's about all of us, about the difference we can make when we look out for each other." The applause that followed was thunderous, filling the room with an energy that felt almost electric. Tom sat down, his heart full, knowing that he had been a part of something truly meaningful. That night, as he walked home beneath a blanket of stars, Tom felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. The streets of Maple Avenue were quiet, but he could feel the life that pulsed through each house, each lighted window. He passed Mrs. Jenkins' old home, now occupied by a young family with 2 children who reminded him of the laughter and life that had once filled those walls. He paused, gazing at the house, feeling a gentle ache of nostalgia mixed with gratitude for all he had shared with her. A few days later, he received a call from a journalist working on a feature story about the Maple Avenue Foundation. She wanted to interview him about the early days of the foundation, to capture the story of how one small act of kindness had grown into a movement. Tom met her at the community center, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness as she set up her recording equipment. She introduced herself as Emma Lee, a bright young woman with an easy smile and an attentive gaze. "Mr. Harrison," she began, her voice filled with respect, "I've read so much about the foundation, but I wanted to hear it directly from you. What was it like in those early days? Did you ever imagine it would become what it is today?" Tom chuckled, scratching the back of his head as he thought back to those days. "You know, Emma, it all started with a feeling. An instinct, I guess. I noticed something was off with Mrs. Jenkins, and I couldn't ignore it. I never thought it would lead to all of this. Back then, it was just about making sure she was okay, about being there when she needed someone." He paused, his eyes distant as he remembered those early days, the small but profound moments that had set everything in motion. But it grew. The community rallied, people came together, and before we knew it, we had something much bigger than any of us. It's a funny thing, isn't it? You start with one small action, and suddenly it's not just about you anymore. It's about everyone. Emma smiled, her eyes shining as she listened. "It's incredible, Mr. Harrison. You've created something that will last long after we're gone, something that will continue to touch lives." As they continued the interview, Tom found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point, the friendships he had forged, the lives he had touched. Each story he shared was a reminder of the impact that compassion and connection could have, of the way people could come together to create something beautiful out of the simplest acts of kindness. When the interview ended, Emma thanked him, her voice filled with admiration. "Thank you for sharing your story, Mr. Harrison. I think it's going to inspire a lot of people." As she left, Tom watched her go, feeling a sense of satisfaction that he couldn't quite put into words. He had shared his story, his life, and in doing so, he had passed on a piece of the legacy they had all built together. The years continued to pass, and as Tom grew older, he gradually scaled back his route, eventually retiring from his position as mailman. But he remained a fixture in the community, attending every foundation event, mentoring new volunteers, and sharing his wisdom with the younger generation. One chilly autumn afternoon, Tom found himself at the community center once again, this time as a guest of honor at the foundation's annual gathering. The center was filled with people from all walks of life, some who had been there since the beginning and others who were experiencing the foundation's impact for the first time. As he looked around, he saw the familiar faces of neighbors, friends, and community leaders, each one a reminder of the journey they had shared. Sarah Chen approached him, her face lit with a smile as she handed him a small plaque. "Tom," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "we wanted to give you this, to thank you for everything you've done." He looked down at the plaque, his eyes misting as he read the words, "In honor of Tom Harrison, whose compassion, courage, and commitment to community will forever be a guiding light for Maple Avenue." The applause that followed was filled with love and gratitude, a testament to the lives he had touched, the legacy he had built. And as he looked out over the crowd, he felt a sense of peace settle over him, a quiet certainty that he had lived a life of purpose, a life that mattered. As the seasons continued to change, Maple Avenue remained a thriving community, its streets filled with the laughter of children, the warmth of friendship, and the strength of unity. The foundation grew, expanding into new neighborhoods, reaching people far beyond the borders of the small town. Tom's story became a part of its legacy, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could create ripples that changed the world. And though Tom eventually passed on, his memory lived on in the hearts of those who knew him, his legacy woven into the fabric of Maple Avenue. His story was shared with each new generation, a tale of courage, compassion, and the power of connection. At the community center, a portrait of Tom and Mrs. Jenkins hung on the wall, a reminder of the two people whose bond had sparked a movement. Beneath the portrait, a small plaque bore a simple inscription: "In a world that often feels too big and too busy, remember that kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change lives." And so, the spirit of Maple Avenue lived on, a beacon of hope in a world that sometimes needed a reminder of the power of kindness, the strength of community, and the legacy of one man who believed that even the smallest acts of compassion could make a difference. New roots on Maple Avenue. Years after Tom's passing, Maple Avenue still thrived, but the streets bore subtle reminders of a time when a single mailman's quiet vigilance had reshaped the neighborhood. The Maple Avenue Foundation, now a regional initiative, was woven deeply into the fabric of each town it touched. Neighboring communities referred to the program as the Tom Model, a way of thinking that reminded everyone of their shared responsibility. The idea that small, intentional acts could lead to profound and lasting change. Tom's name had become synonymous with compassionate action. Today, Maple Avenue was brimming with new faces. Young families had moved into homes that had once been occupied by the neighborhood's older generation. The laughter of children rang through the streets, and colorful chalk drawings adorned driveways and sidewalks. But amid the new life and energy, the stories of Maple Avenue's past lived on, passed down from neighbor to neighbor like family heirlooms. One of the newcomers was a young woman named Lily Brooks. She and her husband, Sam, had recently moved into a quaint cottage-style house on the corner of Maple Avenue with their two small children. As they settled into the community, they often heard neighbors mention Tom Harrison with reverence. Lily had first heard about him from her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who still lived across the street and often welcomed her with a tin of cookies, a gentle reminder of the warmth she had offered Tom so many years before. "Tom was our guardian angel," Mrs. Rodriguez would say, her voice filled with nostalgia. "He made this neighborhood what it is. He taught us all how to look after each other." Intrigued by the stories she heard, Lily began to look into the legacy of Tom and the Maple Avenue Foundation. She discovered articles, old photographs, and even video clips from local news broadcasts documenting Tom's work and the transformative impact of his actions. Each piece of information painted a picture of a man who had quietly woven himself into the lives of his neighbors, someone who had turned a simple job into a mission. One evening, as Lily was organizing some old boxes in her attic, she stumbled upon an old notebook tucked away in a dusty corner. She carefully pulled it out, her curiosity piqued as she flipped through its yellowed pages. Inside were handwritten notes, lists of names, and small observations, details about people she didn't recognize, but that seemed important. She realized it was Tom's notebook, a record of his wellness check program, filled with the names of residents he had watched over, notes about their routines, and even small reminders like Mrs. Rodriguez, Friday cookies. As she read through the pages, Lily felt a wave of admiration wash over her. Tom hadn't just delivered mail. He had delivered care, attention, and a sense of safety. This notebook was a window into his mind, into the compassion that had driven him to go above and beyond. She saw notes about Mr. Thompson, the elderly man who once lived down the street, and even a line mentioning Mrs. Jenkins' dog, Max, keeping watch. Lily couldn't help but feel inspired by Tom's quiet dedication. She thought of her own children, of the community they were growing up in, and realized she wanted to honor Tom's legacy. She wanted her family to be a part of Maple Avenue's tradition of kindness, to ensure that the spirit of care that Tom had fostered continued to thrive. Over the next few weeks, Lily began speaking with her neighbors, sharing Tom's story with those who hadn't known him and reconnecting with those who had. She discovered that, while the Maple Avenue Foundation had expanded far beyond their neighborhood, there was a desire among the residents to bring the original sense of unity and support back to Maple Avenue itself. The foundation had grown so large that some of its roots had become distant, and Lily knew that reviving a smaller, more personal program for Maple Avenue would honor Tom's legacy in a new and meaningful way. With the support of Mrs. Rodriguez and a few other longtime residents, Lily decided to start the Maple Roots Project. This program would focus on the specific needs of Maple Avenue's residents, ensuring that no one, young or old, ever felt alone. They would offer practical support, companionship, and a sense of belonging that mirrored the spirit of Tom's original mission. The first meeting of the Maple Roots Project took place in the community center, the same room where Tom had once stood to speak about his vision. The room was filled with people, some who had lived on Maple Avenue for decades, others who were new to the area but eager to contribute. Parents brought their children, and elderly residents were escorted by neighbors who had come to know them over the years. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, a blend of reverence for the past and excitement for what was to come. Lily stood at the front of the room, feeling a mixture of nerves and pride as she looked out over the crowd. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before she began. "Thank you all for being here," she started, her voice soft but steady. "We're here today to honor a legacy, to build something that will remind us of the values that make Maple Avenue more than just a neighborhood. Tom Harrison showed us what it means to care for each other, to be there for our neighbors in ways big and small. And with the Maple Roots Project, we're going to continue that tradition." The crowd nodded, murmurs of agreement rippling through the room. Lily felt her confidence grow as she spoke, inspired by the warmth and support in the faces before her. "We're going to start small," she continued, "by creating a volunteer network right here on Maple Avenue. This network will be made up of neighbors who are willing to check in on each other, to lend a hand when needed, and to ensure that everyone feels like they're part of a community. We'll hold events, create a shared calendar for community activities, and even organize playdates for the kids. This isn't just about wellness checks. It's about creating a web of support that reaches every single person on this street." The response was overwhelmingly positive. Volunteers signed up eagerly, offering to help with grocery runs, house repairs, pet care, and even tutoring for children. The Maple Roots Project quickly took shape, growing into a network of neighbors who were as committed to each other as they were to honoring Tom's legacy. As the months passed, the Maple Roots Project became a fixture of life on Maple Avenue. Weekly gatherings brought residents together, creating bonds that crossed generational lines. Elderly neighbors were paired with young families who visited regularly, sharing stories and laughter over cups of tea. Children learned to care for their community by helping to plant gardens for their neighbors, delivering homemade cards, and spending time with residents who were alone. One warm spring afternoon, the community gathered for the annual Maple Avenue Picnic, an event organized by the Maple Roots Project. Tables were laden with home-cooked dishes, the air filled with laughter and music as neighbors mingled, sharing food and stories. In the center of the park stood a newly unveiled statue, a bronze figure of Tom Harrison, standing tall with his mailbag slung over his shoulder, a warm, knowing smile etched into his face. Lily's heart swelled as she watched her children approach the statue, gazing up at it with wide-eyed wonder. She knelt beside them, telling them the story of the man who had once walked these very streets, delivering more than just mail. "This is Tom," she said, her voice filled with pride. "He was our neighbor, our friend, and he taught us how to look after each other." Her daughter, a curious 7-year-old with big bright eyes, looked up at her. "Can we be like him too?" Lily smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek as she nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, we can all be like him." The picnic continued into the evening, families spreading blankets on the grass, sharing stories beneath the soft glow of string lights. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had become something of a neighborhood historian, regaled the children with tales of Tom and Mrs. Jenkins, of Max the loyal dog, and of the early days of the foundation. Her voice was filled with nostalgia, each word carrying the weight of memories and the power of connection. As the stars began to fill the sky, the community gathered in a circle around the statue, holding candles in memory of Tom and Mrs. Jenkins. Each person shared a small memory, a gesture of gratitude, a reminder of the impact Tom had left behind. When it was Lily's turn, she spoke softly, her voice carrying through the night. Tom taught us that even the smallest acts of kindness can change lives. He reminded us that we're all connected, that we're all responsible for each other. And because of him, Maple Avenue will always be more than just a place. It will be a community, a family. As she finished, the crowd stood in a reverent silence, the glow of candles reflecting off the statue's face, making it seem as though Tom himself was watching over them, his spirit alive in the people who carried his legacy forward. In the years that followed, Maple Avenue continued to thrive, each new family becoming a part of the neighborhood's story, woven into the tapestry of love, resilience, and connection. The Maple Roots Project flourished, its influence spreading to other streets and towns, each one inspired by the legacy of a simple mailman who had seen his neighbors not as strangers, but as family. And so Tom's spirit lived on, not just in the statue that stood proudly in the center of Maple Avenue, but in the hearts of the people who walked its streets, in the laughter of children who played in its parks, and in the quiet acts of kindness that continued to ripple through the community, touching lives in ways big and small. The legacy of Maple Avenue was more than just a memory. It was a living, breathing testament to the power of compassion, a reminder that, in a world that often felt too big and too busy, there was always room for kindness. And every person who called Maple Avenue home knew, in their hearts, that they were part of something greater, something beautiful, something lasting. They were the living roots of a legacy that would continue to grow, spreading hope, love, and connection to every corner of the world.